Would you risk your life for your career? I'm not being melodramatic, I'm asking a serious question. Not risk losing some money or your job or maybe getting doxxed, but would you risk your life for your career? Well, I'm James Fleck, and welcome to our inaugural episode of Corporate Courage, and that's the question that I'm asking today. I'm a former public company CEO and senior GE executive, and I've been coaching CEOs and their teams for well over a decade now. Way back in the 2010s, I was a regular blogger, first on the Knightsbridge Human Capital site, and then on my own ceoadvisor.ca site. And what I now realize was not a coincidence. I stopped posting in 2016 just when the world was turning upside down as a result of Brexit and the unexpected election of Donald Trump. Well, I'm back, and I have a lot of catching up to do. My hope is that the Corporate Courage series will challenge you and give you some inspiration and practical ideas as you lead your organizations in this never-ending cycle of crises and so-called once-in-a-century events that are rocking our economies, businesses, and societies. Do you remember the world in the first half of 2016? Tech companies were still considered naively well-intentioned, economic growth rate was consistent, and the world seemed to be moving ever closer to political and economic consensus based on Western liberal democracy. Many of us felt that we were living in the socio-political destination described by Francis Fukuyama in his 1992 book, The End of History. Sure, there were some weird outliers like North Korea and Venezuela, and for those who were paying closer attention, Russia. But remember when Mitt Romney said in 2012 that he thought the biggest geopolitical challenge was Russia? Barack Obama ridiculed him, saying that the 1980s wanted their foreign policy back. Sure, Russia had something shifty going on in Crimea, but who was paying attention? I don't know about you, but after 8 years of mayhem, it's hard to really imagine that world. Were we sleepwalking through all kinds of warning signs, or did everything just start going pear-shaped at once? You know, it doesn't really matter, but it is safe to say that the never-ending cycle of trade shocks, geopolitical earthquakes, devastating pandemics, wars, cyber terrorism, erratic interest rates, climate disasters, metastasizing social media, not to mention God knows what will happen next. It's safe to say that this constant state of crises is not going to end anytime soon, and maybe not ever. This is the new normal, and we need to start organizing and operating our businesses under the assumption that this is the case. I titled my very last post in 2016 A Time for Courage because I, like many of us, could see that the road ahead was going to be rocky. The reason I stopped writing at that time is that, frankly, I became swamped in my coaching and consulting practice and I didn't have the time. Some of my clients were facing challenges coming from erratic trade policies or energy transition mandates, and my tech clients were growing at breakneck speed, trying to maximize their land grab of unserved markets in an era of almost free money. Lately, though, a lot of my client work feels like the 1980s and 1990s all over again, when geopolitical crises and erratic financial markets created enormous risk. I think that the period from the 1970s to the early 1990s has a lot to teach us about our current environment. Which leads me back to today's question. Would you risk your life for your career? In 1991, I was never explicitly asked this question, but I suppose it was an implicit assumption. I was a young business development manager at GE International in London, and we all knew that something big was about to happen on the other side of the Iron Curtain. GE had already made its first foray into the East Bloc with the purchase of Tungsram in Hungary, a state-owned lighting company, and I was looking at potential opportunities for our power systems businesses all over the East Bloc. Now, I've been a renewable energy geek since engineering school, and so the idea of developing hydroelectric projects in the East was really exciting to me. At our London office, we had received a strangely clandestine invitation from a former US National Security Advisor to meet with senior officials in the Soviet Republic of Kyrgyzstan to discuss possible hydroelectric projects. I put up my hand, and a few days later in late 1991, I found myself flying from London to Moscow to meet with a motley crew of Russians and expat American operatives who were arranging the visit. Now, I won't say that traveling to Kyrgyzstan in 1991 is exactly the same as traveling to North Korea in 2024, but it's close. On the night before we were scheduled for the 5-hour flight from Moscow to Bishkek, we met at a nondescript restaurant in a Moscow suburb. I was a little confused to see that 3 beautiful young women had joined the group, and after short introductions and explanations, I understood them to be professional ballerinas. They seemed really interested in returning to our hotel with us. Now, I can't remember if I was savvy enough at the time to know what compromat was or what a honeypot operation was, but I was a young husband with a wife expecting our first child, so I didn't take the bait. It did set the tone for a very strange trip. The next morning we met at the chaotic domestic Moscow airport, and after checking in we were ushered into a grimy waiting lounge with a single bathroom and hard seats. The scheduled departure time for the Aeroflot Tupolev 154 came and went with no information. Many more hours passed. We were not allowed to leave the room, and eventually day turned to night. I took my cue from my fellow travelers who seemed to be taking it all in stride, and I noticed that some of them had packed large quantities of food and drink in their carry-ons. One of the American operatives took pity on me and offered a small can of orange juice from his stash. We spent more than 24 hours in that waiting room before we finally boarded the flight to Bishkek. This was quite literally the start of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and Aeroflot was finding it hard to source fuel from other Soviet republics and to perform maintenance on their aircraft. Once airborne, I remember being offered a visit to the cockpit. I was a new pilot at the time, and I was surprised to see that several of the navigation instruments in the cockpit were taped over and not working. I asked the captain, who grinned and said he knew how to get to Bishkek. He also told me that the fuel load was a little light, as they'd only been able to scrounge just enough in Moscow. Landing in fog and darkness, we flew 3 missed approaches before the captain finally made it down to loud applause in the cabin. I remember thinking after the second missed approach that at least we wouldn't need to worry about a fire if we crashed into the trees, because we were certainly running on fumes at that point. By the time we reached the concrete old Soviet-style hotel, complete with intermittent running water, we had a couple of hours to rest before the meeting started. The next week was a flurry of negotiations and site visits way up in the mountains using old Soviet Mi-24 helicopters, again with many inoperable instruments. These were really remote flights, some above the tree line with no rescue equipment on board. And I was keenly aware that if we were lost in the mountains, no one would be coming for us. When I finally was ready to leave Kyrgyzstan, after a productive visit, I was stranded for a few days. While I was in Bishkek, the Soviet Union had finally collapsed, surprisingly and thankfully with no violent revolution. Aeroflot, or what was left of it, no longer flew to Bishkek. I was told that all of the Aeroflot aircraft that happened to be on the apron at the Bishkek airport when Kyrgyzstan declared independence had been seized and turned into a new Kyrgyz airline. The problem was that no one could figure out how to book a flight on this nascent airline, and few flights were running because there was virtually no fuel in the entire republic. I finally did get on a flight which had just enough fuel to make it to Ufa, an oil town in Siberia, and from there I finally made it back to Moscow and then on to London. We continued working with the Kyrgyz government for about 1 year to try to get a project off the ground, but in the end we never could figure out the financing. However, this pioneering spirit did work in other countries, and by the time I left GE Hydro, my colleagues and I had sold many hundreds of millions of dollars of hydro turbines and generators in other newly developing markets. So, is any of this really relevant to the question of whether you would risk your life for your career? I think so. As the world devolves into multipolar blocks, leaders and professional employees of Western companies will face the choice of either withering on the vine or signing up for the unfamiliar task of taking personal risks in countries where they could be detained, injured, or even killed. For entire generations of leaders who grew up in the past 30 years of globalization, this is an alien concept, as almost every region during that time became increasingly similar and safe, but no more. It's time to consider your risk tolerance in this new environment for you and for your teams. Now, I do expect to hear some pushback. My clients, particularly those in heavy industrial and resource sectors, are all committed to safe workplaces, and they scrutinize every lost time accident at the board level. Risking your life for your career or company is not how they think, and I respect that. To be clear, I'm a firm proponent of a strong safety culture, and in fact, one of the proudest moments in my own career was leading a business that was the first recipient of the OSHA Star in the state of West Virginia, meaning that we had voluntarily agreed to hold ourselves to a much higher standard than required by OSHA. I get safety culture, but what I'm talking about is different. Even though we will continue to make operations safer, there will be a need going forward for those of us at the pointy end of the business, CEOs, senior executives, and other pioneers, to venture into situations where risk just can't be fully mitigated. And if you won't take your business there, your competitors will take theirs. Maybe you'll decide not to take the plunge or to split the opportunity with partners and agents who are willing to take those risks. But in any case, you need to have an honest conversation with your board and shareholders about the decisions you have made and about the implications for your relevance and your competitiveness. I'll be building on different aspects of corporate courage in future episodes. Thank you for watching and listening. And if you only take one idea from today, please don't sit and wait for things to get back to normal, because there's no going back to normal. We need courage to face this new uncertainty and to figure out how to thrive in it.